Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
The scene: Ocean City, Maryland, mid-March. Off-season, but it was St. Patrick's Day weekend. A small silver car packed with crazy college students was driving through the inlet. We were driving around the inlet and had reached the point where the main road had dropped down to single lane and the speed limit was 30 miles per hour. Famin, my friend who was from Ocean City and in the passenger seat that was us navigating, warned me that while it was the off-season, the cops were out in force and I really wanted to be careful about speeding. So as I continued doing exactly 30 miles per hour, a weirdo in a red pickup truck with no patience pulled in behind me, and when it became clear I wasn't going to speed at all, he was livid, honked a few times, flashed his brights, and according to my passengers, he was apparently screaming at me. I couldn't really tell, I was too focused on the fact that he appeared to be only inches away from my rear bumper. Now maybe I probably should have pulled off into a side street to get away from the crazy. His pickup could have smashed my little Civic, but I was pissed. I hope he's not on something. Does he not realize there might be a reason I'm not speeding? I said that. If he rams you, I will help you hide the body. A snarky friend of ours who was in the back seat said, just ignore him, seriously. Also, what she said. I just kept on doing the speed limit and kept my eyes on the road. Unfortunately, the weirdo did not decide to ram me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the road expanded to a 3-lane road again, and as soon as the light turned green, the weirdo wasted no time in swerving around me and flying past me, flipping me off as he went. I cruised along at the posted speed limit. Seconds after he flew past me, we saw a cop flag him down. He didn't even make it 3 blocks before he got pulled over. Since there was almost nobody else on the road, I deliberately slowed down a bit to give us enough time for the guy to get out of his car, and we rolled down the windows. As we cruised by, all my friends cheered and waved out the windows. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes up front to keep the cop from having an excuse to pull us over to, but I had enough of a cheering section as it was. My friends blew the cop kisses, the driver looked pissed off, and the cop was cracking up. My friends didn't let him live and kept telling him, we tried to warn you, don't drive angry, and so on. How is that? We headed up the road, still doing the speed limit. Famine summed it up simply, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is why you don't tailgate the locals. I actually spotted that red pickup truck one more time that weekend. He appeared to be very diligently going the speed limit this time. About a year before the whole pandemic thing, I lost my government job. I'm an audiologist, and so I had little doubt I would find work. But I also knew my best bet for top earnings as to work for myself. So I secured my financing, sold a bunch of stocks and mutual funds that had done pretty well and set about finding a property. My plan was to open a practice but buy a building that had rentable space to help bring in an additional revenue stream. I eventually came upon this great little building in the heart of downtown with a nice big parking lot. The building was a former commercial garage. The giant bay doors, where trucks used to come in and out of, were replaced by these really nice walls full of windows that still open like garage doors but form a covered space in front of the units. This is relevant later. I knew the property just from being around town and I thought they really looked cool. They are crisp and modern and, in my opinion, have a cool Scandinavian feel to them. Anyway, I love this building. As I roll up to take my first tour with a realtor and the owner, I pull into the lot, as instructed. The second I step out of my car, I see a woman rushing out of the building towards me. I'm wondering, is this the owner? Someone who works for the owner? No. It's a woman with a face full of piercings loudly telling me I need to move my car now or it will be towed. I have a meeting here. I began. She would have none of it. Move it now or I will call the police. She said that. I was about to move my car when the realtor and the owner on the other side of the lot called over and began walking toward me. She immediately retreated before they got close enough for us to work all of this out. I clarified that I was okay to park there and they confirmed it was fine. I asked who that was and they told me she owns one of the shops in the unit. Just ignore her. The owner said she thinks she runs the place, and the realtor and owner shared a chuckle. I walk the property and we go over some things and life is good. I get in my car and leave pretty convinced that this is the place I need to buy. Because I also intended to house my practice there, I agreed to lease one of the units and start getting set up while all of the closing stuff that needed to happen could be completed. So for about 2 months, I was a tenant just like all the other tenants. I never really got into the fact that I was buying the building because my interactions with my neighbors were polite but transactional. Well, mostly polite. The woman was all of the yelling, let's call her Megan, was none too pleased with my presence. She owned a store that sold custom-made, well, costumes, I suppose. Lots of steampunk outfits and period costumes that she makes herself. Impressive work though, honestly. I have to imagine she does most of her trade online since I seldom see people in her place. I was there not more than a week when she barged in my unit and began making sure I was aware that the parking lot was not for customers, it was for them only. And I was only allotted one spot. I said, thanks, but I have parking all worked out with Gus, the owner. I appreciate your concern. And I showed her the door. The parking lot, which I was purchasing along with the building, has 60 spaces. There are 5 units. According to her, we are each allowed one parking space, and no customers or visitors are permitted to park there at all. So I know there are either shenanigans afoot or this woman is speaking out of her A. Anyway, I ignored her. Time passes, I close on a building. Gus sends out a heartwarming thank you email to all the tenants saying he appreciates 3 years of business together, but that the property is now owned by my company name, LLC, of which I am the owner. Pretty clear stuff. The very first thing I did was I did a reorg on the parking lot. Each unit gets one regular parking space. Primo spots right next to the building. There are 2 15-minute loading spots back there as well. I designated the next 5 closest spaces to handicap parking. The rest was just parking. My long-term plan is to put in one of those automated parking kiosks so people who are there to patronize the businesses can park for free, but anyone else will have to pay. But that's down the road. For now, I just need to formalize some stuff and just accept that I may have some people parking there illegally. And if it becomes a problem, I'll just have to hit the security cameras to see who's abusing the system. Anyway, Megan is furious. She's furious that there are not enough handicap spots. There were none before. She's pissed that she needs more than 15 minutes for a loading zone. Who's timing it? She is pissed most of all, however, because she was never consulted. Flash forward a few days and I parked on a non-parking spot. The sidewalk in front of my building is privately owned. Basically, you turn off of the public sidewalk and walk down the private sidewalk to where all the businesses are. I parked on a paved patch next to my unit, on the far side away from the public sidewalk, accessible only by my parking lot. I parked there with every legal right to do so, by the way, because I was unloading equipment. Since I owned the space I was parked on and everything around it, I didn't move my car right after. I walk outside and my car is gone. So I immediately assumed someone stole my car. Then there's Megan standing in her doorway with a big grin on her face. I ask her if she knows anything about my missing car. "Oh, was that your car? I saw a car parked illegally, so I had it towed." I said, "Laugh it up. Any expense is getting added to your rent." I went to the tow company that the prior owner hired, and I laid into him for towing anything from my property without authorization. His argument was that he had a contract with the property. He did not. He had a contract with the company that formerly owned the building that was now null. In the end, I knew arguing will get me nowhere, so I paid him and took my car. I left with hate in my heart and my mind solely focused on revenge. I began really scrutinizing my security tapes and discovered that all of these unaccounted for vehicles in the parking lot all had something in common. Megan. I had a suspicion that she was selling parking in my lot, so I waited by one of the cars until the guy arrived. I told him as he walked from an area that was not my building that he was not authorized to park there. He looked confused and told me to mind my own business and he pays for parking. I introduced myself as the owner of the lot and asked who he was paying. And how much. The answer was Megan and $125 a month. Suddenly her business made a lot more sense. I thought of confronting her. I thought of just straight up evicting her. But instead, I hired a security company. They set up a temporary booth at the entrance of the parking lot, and the guard ensured that everyone there was there for one of the businesses. If someone parked and wandered off somewhere else, they were told they were going to be towed. Anyone who claimed to be paying for parking would just be turned away. What followed was around 24 very angry people in Megan's store over the course of the week. They paid good money for those spots and now she was pulling out the carpet. People were just mad. Megan lays pretty low for a while. Then COVID strikes and we're all rightly in fear for our livelihood. As soon as it was legal, I told the tenants they could open the big garage door and have a covered outdoor space for their trade. This was a necessary thing to keep them open. It was outside the scope of their lease since they were not allowed to put in outdoor seating and so on. Everyone is super happy about this except Megan. Megan's unit is flanked by a coffee shop on one side and a little specialty bakery on the other. So you now have to walk around an outdoor seating area to get into her store. It's the same situation for my unit, however, and it just isn't that big of a deal. Megan is fuming. She starts calling the police multiple times a day, every day, for supposed COVID violations on my part and the part of the other tenants. This was after, by the way, I said absolutely nothing about her being in her store and working even when non-essential businesses were supposed to be closed. The cops stopped coming after her third or fourth call. At this point, I had enough. Her lease was up last May, and so I non-renewed it. She threatened up and down that she was going to sue me, but when she was done, the whole building will be hers. I responded by suing her for the $125 a month she collected from all those people for parking. Best of all, she just didn't show up to court, and so it resulted in a summary judgment in my favor. I do not expect I will collect, though she abandoned at least a few $1,000 worth of inventory and equipment when she left. So, that'll help.
It was one of those Saturdays where the sun decided to be generous. My wife just popped her head into the garage where I was fiddling with my old bike and said, "How about we do something different today?" Different how? I asked. "Picnic. The girls would love it," she suggested. I paused, considering the idea. Our weekends usually rotated between movies, malls, and visiting relatives. A picnic wasn't just different, it was a whole new territory for us. Picnic it is. I agreed. Finally, looking at her, her smile was worth 1,000 sunny days. Jess got into planning mode immediately. She was always the organizer, making less than plans, while I was more of the go-with-the-flow type. The girls, Mia and Rosie, were over the moon. They danced around the living room singing some made-up song about going to the park. Jess handled the food, making sandwiches and slicing fruits, while I packed the car with a blanket, some games, and a frisbee. The girls, well, they were in charge of excitement, which they took very seriously. By the time we reached the park, it was filled with families, dogs, and the smell of fresh grass. We found a spot under a big oak tree, perfect for both shade and people watching. The girls ran around while Jess and I set up our little picnic spots. "So this is nice, huh?" I said, taking a bite of the chicken sandwich Jess made. "Better than nice. It's perfect," she replied. For a moment, the world outside our little picnic bubble ceased to exist. Then our peaceful scene was interrupted by commotion. A woman, visibly agitated, was making her way towards us. Two kids trailing behind her. Jess nudged me, nodding in their direction. "Looks like trouble," she said. I noticed them too. The woman was fixated on us, or more specifically on me. I stood up, ready to face whatever this was. About. My family's safety always came first, and I wasn't about to let anyone disturb our peaceful outing without a good reason. As the woman approached, her pace quickened, her eyes never leaving mine. "What's going on?" Jess whispered, concerned, standing up next to me. "I don't know, but stay behind me," I said, positioning myself slightly in front of my family. Mia and Rosie stopped their play, sensing the tension, and came closer to us. The woman finally reached us, barely catching her breath. Her two kids stood behind her. One looked about 9, his face stained with tears and dirt, while the other slightly older. "You!" She pointed a shaking finger at me, then shifted her accusing gaze to Mia. "Your daughter hurt my son. She scratched him up and pushed him down the slide." I looked at Mia, who looked confused and a bit scared. "Mom, Dad, I didn't do anything," she whispered. "Ma'am, there must be some mistake. We've been here for about 40 minutes and my daughters haven't left my sight." "Lies! My son doesn't lie. He told me it was her," she insisted, pointing at Mia again. Jess then stepped in. "Let's just calm down and talk about this. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. Your daughter is a bully." The woman was nearly screaming now, attracting stares from nearby picnickers. At that moment, her son, the younger one, spoke up through his tears. "Mom, it was another girl, not her. She had a different dress." The woman's face went from anger to confusion, then back to anger. She shook her head, dismissing her son's words. "No, it was her. I know it." As the woman's accusations grew more heated and her refusal to listen escalated, the situation took a drastic turn. Despite my efforts and Jess's pleas for calm, the woman, blinded by rage, made a move that none of us were prepared for. In a split second that seemed to stretch into eternity, she reached out and grabbed Mia's hair, yanking it so hard that Mia cried out in pain. The shock of seeing my daughter hurt right in front of my eyes triggered the protective instinct I couldn't suppress. "Mia!" Jess screamed in horror. Without a moment's hesitation, my response was driven by a primal urge to protect my child. As the woman tugged on Mia's hair, calling her names and threatening further harm, I stepped forward. Adrenaline coursing through my veins as I reached out and firmly grabbed the woman's wrist, pulling her hand away from my daughter. "Let her go!" I screamed. But the situation had escalated far beyond reason, and in that moment I knew words were futile. With my daughter in tears and this stranger assaulting her, I did what I felt was necessary to end the threat. With my free hand, I struck the woman squarely in the nose, a defensive move to incapacitate her and ensure she could no longer harm Mia. The impact was swift and the woman stumbled back, releasing her grip on Mia as she fell to the ground, unconscious. The immediate aftermath was a blur. Jess rushed to console Mia, who was sobbing and holding her head, while Rosie stood by, wide-eyed and scared. I looked around, realizing that all eyes in the park were on us. My heart was still racing, not just from the altercation, but from the fear of what could have happened to my daughter if I hadn't intervened. "Call the police and get someone to check on her," I told Jess. Jess nodded, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Park security arrived quickly, followed by the police and an ambulance. As the medical team attended to the woman, now regaining consciousness, the police began to take statements from us and the gathered crowd. Throughout the questioning, my only thoughts were with Mia. The sight of her in pain, the sound of her cry, it all replayed in my mind. I explained to the officers what happened, every detail. When they reviewed the CCTV footage, it corroborated our story, showing the unwarranted attack and my immediate reaction. One of the officers, after taking my statement, nodded in understanding. He said, "Given the circumstances, your reaction was within the bounds of protecting your child." He said that. His tone wasn't just professional, there was a hint of respect in it. "You've got quick reflexes. When he inquired about my profession, perhaps looking for context to my actions, I mentioned that I'm a fighter pilot. His nod then carried an extra layer of comprehension, as if the pieces of the puzzle fell into place for him. Ah, that explains a lot, he seems to suggest without saying it outright. Though his words offered some comfort, they couldn't shake the deep unease I felt. Any parent, I believed, would have reacted to protect their child. The situation had escalated beyond any normal dispute, pushing me into a corner where I had to act decisively. And act I did, though not without a heavy heart. I decided to press charges against the woman for her attack on my daughter. With the formalities out of the way, we gathered our belongings, our picnic so abruptly ended, and headed home. The car ride was somber. Mia, in particular, seemed to retreat into herself, a clear sign of the trauma she'd just experienced. She wasn't physically injured, thankfully, but the emotional and psychological scars were definitely there. Being yanked by her hair by a stranger, accused unjustly, and then witnessing a physical altercation had left a mark. She became wary of unfamiliar faces, hesitant to venture into crowded places like parks. However, time has a way of healing. In the weeks and months that followed, with love, support, and professional guidance, Mia began to find her way back. She was slowly reclaiming her space in the world, learning to navigate her fears and anxieties. Also, I found myself hoping in the quiet moments that followed our departure from the park that day, the Karen's two boys would find their way through the madness brought on by their mother's actions. My heart went out to them, wishing them a better life than the one they apparently were living. So this is my recently passed / somewhat estranged uncle's story. He told me this story about 5 years before he passed, and I even had it confirmed by my dad. I had to have it confirmed because my uncle had turned into a very hard drug user and his brain was basically fried every time I saw him. Anyway, so my dad had two brothers, one older, one younger. The story is about the older one, who we will call Steve. Growing up, the three of them went to public school, played sports, and so on. And they were very well-liked kids for the area. All smart and came from a good family. However, this school was a pretty tough school on Long Island, and my dad and his brothers would get into a fight maybe once a month. The younger uncle more than anyone else because they thought he was an easy target. There was a guy that they were growing up with named John. John was one of those giant kids, 6 feet tall by the time he's 12, has a beard, looks like a grown man at 16. Throughout school, he was a jerk. My dad has a story of him playing basketball at PE and my dad scoring against him, and he whispered in my dad's ear, "If you score again, you're going to be hurt." As the game went on, of course my dad scored and he tells me he just remembers sliding across the wood floor after getting punched in the face as he was running back on defense. Safe to say the guy was a jerk. So they all graduate and John is now 6'8", 280 pounds easy, and a local thug in the labor union, mafia, doing drugs on the side. Extorting people as well, but no one wanted to go against him because he was a known murderer and he had mob ties. But he was losing face with them recently, which is important. He wasn't convicted, but he had killed something like 5 people brutally. My uncle Steve has started selling coke in some pots after they all were adults. I would deal with John sometimes. He always had the nicest car, the hottest girls, and the newest plank. But John knew he was making money. So one night while my uncle is weighing out some stuff, he gets a knock on the door and it's none other than John. He comes in with a chainsaw and tries selling it to my uncle. "Steve, you see this new chainsaw? I need to sell it for $500. Typical extortion. "I don't need a chainsaw, John. I'm fine." "You're going to buy this chainsaw, Steve." Laughing, he said, "No, I'm not. I don't need it." John proceeds to walk out and slam the chainsaw through my uncle's brand new Corvette's windshield. And he walks away. A week later, my uncle had gone to pick it up at the shop and left his girlfriend home to watch over the coke and whatnot. Well, while he was gone, he came to the house, kicked in the door and beat my uncle's girlfriend. He found her hiding in the closet. Later that night, he got a call and it was John, trying to sell him something again. I don't remember the exact conversation, but it was something like this with the threats.
Steve, if you don't buy this, the next people I'll visit are your younger brothers. I remember them from school, and I know where your parents live. Screw you, John. What did you say? I'll be over at your place at 11, and we can talk. So my uncle got his girlfriend out of the house and decided what he needed to do. He had a double-barrel shotgun and set up his kitchen. His house was situated in a way so that when you open the front door right to the left was a kitchen, and there was a hallway to get back towards the living room. The only light in that hall is right about the front door, so my uncle took his oven out of its nook and situated it a certain way to where he could hide behind it. He turned every light off besides the one in the hallway, and he waited. 11 o'clock rolls around and a loud knock on the door. Steve, open the door. Screw you, get out of here. Door is kicked in and John, the hulking bully that he is standing in the hallway just beneath the light. He had a pistol in his hand, so my uncle shot. Like I said, my uncle told me this story when his brain was fried after years of drug abuse, so this next interaction might not be 100% true, but this is how he told it to me. John fell to his knees, clutching his chest where he was shot, and looked down and was angry. Not scared or anything, freaking pissed. Like if you hit a gorilla with a BB gun. Steve, you jerk! You're going to drive me to the hospital now. My uncle says he said, no, I'm going to send you to hell. But I doubt it. But he then shot John in the face and basically blew his head off. He told me the fireball that came out of the gun went in slow motion and he was in shock. He calmly put the gun down, walked to his phone and called the police department and told them what had happened. My mom and dad had just started dating around this time and had a trip planned to go skiing in Vermont, so they were planning on waking up at like 2 a.m. to start driving. But my mom's mom, grandma, obviously was staying with my parents and heard the phone ring, and she let the answering machine pick up. She's a bit of an oddball and doesn't do things like most normal people, so she heard the message on a voicemail. My parents wake up and my dad tells me that my grandma says something to him like, oh, and while you were sleeping, there was a message from your brother saying something about killing John Russo. And my dad was like, what the heck? Why wouldn't you tell me? So my mom and dad get in their car and drive over to my uncle's house. My dad's younger brother and his wife are already there, and the older uncle is sitting on a porch talking to a police officer. My dad pulled another officer aside and got the whole story from him. My dad asked if there was going to be a crime or if he would go to jail, and the cop said no. John was a known bully and criminal, and the story that my uncle told completely absolved him of murder. It was deemed a justified homicide. He had to go to court obviously, but nothing ever happened to him. So my uncle saved all of my family's lives, including mine, but my other uncle and dad both say that it ruined him and he turned to hard drugs shortly after. He just passed away last month, but I never really got a chance to thank him for his revenge. So I thought I'd share it here. This week was our middle school reunion. Most of us went to the same K-8 school, ages 6 to 14 for our friends across the pond. And while we were all laughing and talking over Zoom, my friend, whom I will call Janice, brought up this memory. At our schools, with the exception of kindergarten, 2 grades will be paired together, so 1st and 2nd grades will be taught together, 3rd and 4th will be taught together, so on and so forth. The 7th and 8th grades had to do a special project every year called Toy Team. Basically, we will be put into teams, build a specific toy that we could market, representatives from local businesses will be invited to judge our projects and win awards in various categories. Best presentation, best design, best research, and so on. The idea behind this project was to teach teamwork, ingenuity, creativity, and so on. But in the end, it caused more trouble than it was worth, for reasons I will get to in a moment. I hated Toy Team with a passion. The biggest reason being that the boys would take over the building of the toy and the girls did the secretarial work, listing results, surveying the groups, writing final reports, and so on. It wasn't fair, but I was always too afraid to speak my mind and ask to help building, something I've always enjoyed. But 8th grade year was the one that almost broke me because of one kid. Enter Carlos, not his real name. Carlos was in 7th grade but was touted as a math and science genius. He had to go to the local high school to take math/science classes because none of the teachers at our school were qualified to teach at his level. He also prided himself on being a cool kid and had a gang of sycophants follow him around, reaffirming his greatness. In reality, Carlos was a little punk who honestly should have used a lesson or two in a school of hard knocks. He was a jerk to the highest degree, always looked down on everyone else, and since his parents, who were honestly Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy come to life, defended his actions and threatened everyone around them. Because it was a private school and Carlos' parents were big donors, even the teachers were limited in what they could and couldn't do to discipline him. The worst they could do was detention, but he just shrugged it off. Seriously, unless he killed someone, Carlos was untouchable. Janice and I were thrilled to be in the same group, until we learned we'd be paired with Carlos. Carlos immediately took over the project and bossed Janice and me around. Janice and I were favorite targets for Carlos and his sycophants because we were quiet, kept to ourselves, and just focused on our work. Carlos proceeded to make our experience in TOET miserable. He claimed that because he was a big math and science expert, only he could build our glider and we had to write it down. Janice and I put up with it at first because we knew our teachers would do nothing and it was just an 8-week-long group project. Then one day during week 6 it happened. We had to test the gliders. Our testing rig was set up with yardsticks and rubber bands on tables. You'd load the gliders into the rubber bands, pull them back and launch. Then you'd measure how far they flew and make your corrections. Once again, the boys took over and the girls did the recording. Janice and I were making notes when I noticed the rubber band was about to snap due to how stretched out it was. I warned Carlos about the rubber band and to adjust the glider. When he protested, our teacher, who I will call Mrs. Adams, snapped at him and told him, "Listen to your partners and adjust." Well, Carlos did as said, but he pulled back the glider back too far and too fast. As a result, the rubber band snapped. The rubber band not only slapped Carlos in the face, but broke our glider to pieces because he pulled it back too far and the force hit the fragile wood. Carlos was pissed and turned his anger on me. "No wonder you suck at math and science," he said that. This, in addition to all the stuff going on, broke me. It's true that math and science were my worst subjects, because I have a learning disability that makes those subjects tough, but I've always loved building and repairing things. My dad's an engineer and some of my earliest memories were of him teaching me how to fix my toys and encouraging me to experiment with different building things. In addition, I was a total daddy's girl. I wanted to make him proud and I knew that me being bad at math and science was something that stressed him out. So I'm not joking, I ran away like in those cliché 90s movies. My house was 2 blocks away and I ran there. Fortunately, my teachers knew that there weren't many places I could have gone and called my mom, who was a stay-at-home mom, to tell her what happened and to please return me to school. What I didn't know was that Dad was working home that day. When I ran in, crying and upset, he noticed and went after me. He calmed me down and asked what happened. I told him everything about Carlos taking over, about how Janice and I were doing all the hard work and Carlos being a nasty bully, the rubber band snapping and me getting blamed. Dad was quietly hugging me, kissing my forehead, and when Dad is quiet, that usually means he's angry. When I looked up, I saw that his mouth was set in a hard line and his eyes were dark. I was scared he was angry at me. I begged him to not be mad at Janice or me because it wasn't our fault. Dad instead reassured me that he wasn't mad at Janice or me. He was mad at Carlos and had an idea to teach that little punk a lesson. Dad then called the school, reassured Mrs. Adams that I was okay and that I would spend the rest of the day at home. He also sent an email to not only Mrs. Adams but Janice's parents detailing this plan of his. Janice's parents and Mrs. Adams were game. After we heard it, Janice and I were smiling ear to ear. Even though we knew we had to put in the work all by ourselves, The next day, Mrs. Adams pulled Carlos, Janice, and me aside and said, thanks to the glider incident, Carlos was now on his own and had to finish the project by himself. Janice and I will be doing our own project. Carlos was pretty happy about this because those two slowed me down. However, what Carlos was not thinking about was that since Janice and I were doing all the paperwork, we had all the information. We offered to share our notes with him in an attempt to be fair, but he said, it's all in my head, and I don't need it to slow me down. In fact, I bet I can do it even better. We all had to sign a contract that information was not exchanged, witnessed by Mrs. Adams. The next 2 weeks were easily the best of toy team for Janice and me. Since we had all the notes, we were able to rebuild the glider in less than a week. Our dads even set up a makeshift glider range for us to test, and we spent an entire Saturday flying the gliders, one in red, the other in blue, which were the most popular colors according to our surveys. As a result, we improved our glider and even made a game out of it, racing them. When Janice's dad mentioned the red and blue gliders reminded him of the Gemini dueling coaster at Cedar Point, we decided to name the toys after the coaster and make them a 2-for-1. When Janice's dad mentioned the red and blue gliders reminded him of the Gemini dueling coaster at Cedar Point, we decided to name the toys after the coaster and make them a 2-for-1. We built a box for our gliders, got our calculations double-checked by not only Mrs. Adams but 2 independent adults as well. Both dads, who were co-workers, signed off on the math, even adding their proof of work and signing the back. This is important for later. A presentation board with an overview and along with a huge binder showing all of our work. Janice and I worked really hard on this project and it felt awesome. On our last day, we had a pizza party and sleepover, making bets of what Carlos' reaction was most likely going to be. Presentation day arrived. This was one of the few days we could wear something else other than our school uniform. So we were dressed in nice outfits to make our presentations. Janice and I stood together with our gliders and had big smiles on our faces. We looked at Carlos, who had an actual nice looking glider, box, presentation board, paperwork and everything. However, he had an anxious look on his face instead of his usual arrogant one, which made me happier. Presentation day worked like this. The first half of the day would be the representatives walking around and judging who had the best looking gliders, boxes, presentation boards, binders and so on. Then we'd have lunch and come back. The ones who had been selected for the second round would then make their presentations to not only the representatives, but the entire class. Janice and I answered the questions asked by the representatives. We arrived with confident and clear answers. One of the businesses that attended was the engineering firm that our dad worked for. They were impressed with our presentation and selected us for the second round. Carlos was also selected, and he had a worrisome look on his face when the bell rang. After lunch, we returned, and something about the way the binder was sitting made me double-check. Wouldn't you know it? The pages with double-checked calculations and proof of work were gone. Carlos, being the jerk he was, didn't keep notes about his experiments, so he decided to steal our work and present it as his own. Janice and I decided to take a professional approach in order to grind Carlos further into the dirt. I went up to Mrs. Adams and the representatives and asked them if they had gone through our binder when we were gone, because the calculations and proof of work pages were missing. Mrs. Adams was immediately suspicious as well, given Carlos' behavior, and immediately walked over, took his binder off the table, flipped through it, and found the corrections page. He had hastily scrawled in his name at the top next to ours, so it looked like he was involved. Mrs. Adams looked at him and said, "Carlos, why did you take the pages?" Carlos said, "They gave their work to me, remember?" Fortunately, Janice and I included our copy of the signed contract from earlier, saying Carlos had refused use of our information in our binder and pulled it out. At this point, Carlos looked like the kid who denied he had been eating cookies even though he had a ring of crumbs around his lips. "Well, they stole my double-checked work, see? He shows a proof of work our dads had done. I took it out and put it back." Then Janice looked at one of the men, who I later learned was the supervisor of the team both of our dads were part of, and said, "Mr. Lionel, could you please check his proof of work? Our dad signed the back of ours." Mr. Lionel agreed and flipped the page over. Carlos did not notice that our dads had signed the back of the proof of work and included their names. Mr. Lionel nodded. "I know those signatures anywhere," he said before looking at Carlos with a glare that could wilt a flower. "You told me you wanted to be an engineer someday, right?" Carlos could only nod, his face white. "You're aware that engineers take theft of others' work seriously?" Again, Carlos nodded. "And that if you were doing this in a professional setting, you'd not only be fired from the company but blackballed from the industry," Mr. Lionel said, staring down at Biscuit. Carlos looked like a melted snowman and that he wanted to disappear into the ground. I learned later that Mr. Lionel was a nice man. But man, I could immediately see why our dads respected him in that moment. Mr. Lionel turned to Mrs. Adams. "I recommend that he be disqualified from the next round and be made to apologize to these two girls in addition to returning the proofs to them." Carlos did return the paper and apologize for the theft, not looking me in the eye. As a result, not only was Carlos disqualified, but because he cheated, he flunked the project as a whole. Since the team was at least 30% of our science grade, he ended up getting his first D on his report card, which his parents had a freaking field day with until Mr. Lionel sent him a letter telling them what their son had done and that if he didn't shape up, he risked real trouble in his professional life. Janice and I ultimately won Best Design, but the best award was seeing Carlos' ego get knocked down several pegs. He was still a jerk, but was scared of us. Hey, I might be bad at math and science, but at least I know not to be mean to people who might help me someday. Okay, so this story took place back when I was in Florida in the early 90s. It does involve an act of vandalism that is connected to revenge. Anyway, South Florida was devastated by Hurricane Andrew. My dad, as part of a local charity, was set up day after day at a local market seeking donations from shoppers to give to food banks. You have to understand this storm left many people homeless and without power, in some cases for 6+ months in Florida heat and humidity. My father was legally disabled from a serious car accident. He was hit by a drunk driver in the early 80s and suffered from relentless hip and back problems. It never killed his heart or kindness to others, hence the charity work. One day he was about to pull into the disabled space at the local market to go buy a few items to donate to the hurricane charity. Right before he's about to pull in, this lady pulls into the space in the shiny red Porsche. My dad parks behind her and says, "Excuse me, ma'am, I was about to pull in there," and also points to his disabled placard in a window. She says to him, "You don't look disabled," and proceeds to walk into the store. For anyone who has a relative who uses a disabled space, you know the frustration of the situation and the anger one feels. My dad, seemingly unfazed, waits until she goes into the store and then gets out and snips the valve stems on all 4 tires, flattening but not destroying all of them. He then pulls into another space not far away and just waits. About 15 minutes later, the lady comes out and is shrieking about her car being vandalized. My dad is far enough away so she can't see him, but he can hear everything. He calls the police, big mistake. She files a report for vandalism, and the police give her a ticket for being parked in a disabled space with no placard. About $250 at the time. The cops leave and she calls a tow truck. As the car is being loaded onto the truck, my dad pulls up and says to her, "You don't look disabled, but your car sure is," and then drives off. My dad could be a nice guy and pure savage when he needed to be.